Okay, so now let's go ahead and move on to the digestive system. This one is a bit of a long one, but bear with me. It's not going to be overly complicated. There's just a lot of different organs that we have to talk about individually. We'll break this one down into 5 different videos so that it is more digestible for you. You don't have to laugh at my jokes. So what are we going to cover with this chapter? We're going to talk about the basic functional anatomy of organs that are involved in digestion, as well as their accessory organs. We're going to talk about how food moves through the digestive tract, and then get into the anatomy of the accessory organs, including the liver, pancreas, and gallbladder, and kind of talk about how they assist with the digestive process. So if we think about the digestive system, this system is always working. You don't need to think about it. It just takes in what you need, and everything else it gets rid of. So basically the food that you eat, I just ate dinner, right? So right now my digestive system is working on pulling just the nutrients that are usable and it's going to get rid of all the extra stuff, all of the stuff I cannot break down and utilize will then exit out the other end. And this is what helps keep us going in our day-to-day lives, right? And you've probably ever noticed that on days that you don't eat, right, you don't feel good, right? On days or times where you have maybe forgotten to eat or skipped a meal for whatever reason, or we're in a position where you just didn't have an opportunity to eat, you probably start to feel less than ideal, right? Tired, slow, right? Things of that nature. So for this video, we're going to just focus on this one, which is just the organs of the digestive system. We're going to talk about the alimentary canal from proximal to distal, so starting basically with mouth and working our way down. Talk about the accessory organs and their basic primary functions, and then we're going to really get into the 4 fundamental tissue layers and talk about those. And then we'll talk about how the nervous system is going to help with the digestive system functioning, in particular the autonomic and the enteric nervous systems. And then we'll get into the peritoneum and the mesenteries as well. So if we think about the basic functions of the digestive system, it's taking the food and the drinks that we consume, right? Break that food down to a chemical level, release those nutrients that our body can utilize, absorb those nutrients into the bloodstream, and then all the unwanted, unusable stuff gets eliminated out the other end. That's really the basics of the digestive system. Now I mentioned this alimentary canal. This is just basically the digestive tract, right? It's like a fancy name, a fancy term for digestive tract, where it's just running from mouth all the way to the other end. If you think about it, you're basically hollow all the way through, just a bit more complicated. So I might use alimentary canal, but I might also use digestive tract or gastrointestinal GI tract. So you may see those other names. We're talking about the same thing there. And then the accessory organs, these are structures, these are organs that are going to help with the digestive process, but they do not directly come into contact with the food that you ate, right? So everything in the digestive tract will physically handle the food that you ate in whatever state it's in, but the accessory organs do not touch it. They do not come into contact with anything that you ate. They're going to just send things to those digestive tract organs and help with that process. So if we look at the different structures, the different organs we find in the digestive system that we're going to talk about, we'll talk about the mouth and the tongue, we'll talk about salivary glands, the pharynx, the esophagus, the liver and gallbladder, the stomach, the spleen, the pancreas, and then with the small intestines, we'll talk about the different regions, the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And then the large intestines as well, with the ascending, transverse, descending colon, as well as the cecum, the sigmoid colon, and the appendix, and then lastly the rectum and anal canal and anus. So a lot of parts. That's why, again, that's why this one's so long, because we have to talk about each individual part. But again, we're not going to get super crazy detailed about every single one of these. So how does the digestive system help with other body systems? First and foremost, we're going to be getting, we're going to be getting blood oxygen, nutrients from the cardiovascular system, and we're going to be pulling the nutrients to add to that blood supply. Our digestive system is susceptible or responds to hormones that will help regulate the digestive glands. The integumentary system is going to synthesize vitamin D so we can absorb calcium better in our digestive system. Lymphatic system is going to help prevent the entry or defend against the entry of pathogens. We talked about MALT, the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, the Peyer's patches specifically, that were associated with the GI tract, and so that's going to help prevent us from getting sick, right? We also have the lacteals, which are going to be kind of married with the small intestine for the absorption of lipids. On the muscular side, skeletal muscles are going to support and protect the abdominal organs. Since you think down in your belly region where a lot of your GI organs are, we don't have bones to cover those necessarily. We use a lot of muscle. Nervous is going to help control the secretions and the muscle contractions in the GI tract. Respiratory will remove that carbon dioxide and provide oxygen. Skeletal will also help protect and support some organs. And then urinary, the kidneys can convert the vitamin D from inactive to active, which then helps with the calcium absorption. So if we look at what's part of the alimentary canal, again, the GI tract, the digestive tract, it's really these main parts. The mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small and the large intestine, right? So this is just the pathway the food's going to take, right? Everything you eat, you put it in your mouth, and it's going to go from point A all the way down to point B, right? And through all the things in between. Now in terms of accessory structures, we already mentioned the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas, but we also are going to get some help from the salivary glands, the tongue, and the teeth. But before we get into the individual organs and talk about their details, we're going to talk about the histology, the basics of the alimentary canal. And really this comes down to the 4 layers. Now on the very, very inside, you're going to have the open space called the lumen. You'll notice that that word comes back a lot. Anytime you're talking about the open space inside of like a tube, you're thinking lumen. And so facing the lumen, on the very most inner part of the GI tract, we have the mucosa. Just under that is the submucosa, then the muscularis externa, or the muscularis, you might just see that. And then the serosa is the outermost layer, right? So these are the 4 layers we see as part of the GI tract. Mucosa being the one on the inside, serosa being the outermost layer of the 4. And so this is just our generic, right, kind of structure we're seeing here, kind of showing these layers. So let's talk ourselves through them. So again, I mentioned the lumen, that's just the open space, right, the open space. Then we have the mucosa. The mucosa is going to have a few different parts to it. We have the epithelium, which is on the inner side, the lamina propria, which is this beige, and then we do have a very thin layer of muscle called the muscularis mucosae. It's not part of the muscularis layer, it's still part of the mucosa. Within this, we're going to find things like the lymphatic tissues, we can find glands, we can find ducts, right? Things that are going to help secrete things into that inner lumen. Then we get to the submucosa. We see some of those glands extend all the way into that submucosa. We can have blood vessels and like nerve plexuses to form in there. And then we get to the muscularis. Right, the muscularis layer is like much thicker. So we look at like the super thin muscularis mucosae. Okay, that's nice. But this muscularis layer, the muscularis externa, has 2 different layers of muscle that run basically perpendicular to each other. We have the longitudinal muscle, which in this case runs the length, and then the circular muscle, which runs around. So the fibers run perpendicular to each other. For the most part, we'll see 2 layers. We'll talk about the one exception where we do see 3. And then on the very outside, we have the serosa, which is like a nice covering made of areolar connective tissue and epithelium. Right? And then we also may see mesentery, which is going to help anchor us down. So let's talk about the mucosa first. We mentioned the three layers, the epithelium, the lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa. Let's take a peek at the epithelium first. This is going to be non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So layers and layers of flat cells are going to be in the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, and the anal canal. So that's the type we'll find in those areas. And then as we get deeper into the GI tract and like the stomach and the intestines, we have the simple columnar epithelium. And hanging out with those columnar epithelial cells, we'll also have goblet cells. These are going to secrete mucus. That's their whole job, is send out mucus. And then the enteroendocrine cells will secrete hormones. When we go beyond that, we get down to the lamina propria. This is going to be loose connective tissue. We find things like blood and lymphatic vessels here. This is also where we'll find those like Peyer's patches. This is where we'll find like lymphoid tissue to help provide protection against pathogens. And then the very last thing in the mucosa is the muscularis mucosa. And again, it's super thin, smooth muscle. This is always tense, and this is what's going to be used to create folds like in the small intestine and the stomach, and this is going to increase our surface area. The more surface area we have, the more we can secrete and the more we can absorb, because that means there's more, like whatever we've eaten, it has more surface to come into contact with. And when it comes into contact with that surface, then we can absorb it, right? And we'll talk about that when we get to like the small intestine. Just beyond that, we get to the submucosa. This is going to be dense, irregular connective tissue, kind of similar to the dermis of the skin, right? Blood and lymphatic vessels also run through here. We have glands that will secrete the digestive enzymes, and then we also have the nervous system coming into play in the submucosal plexus, all these nerves that are going to stimulate the muscularis mucosa so that those stay tense. Then we get to our thick muscle layer, the muscularis externa. This has an inner circular layer of smooth muscle, and then over the top of that we have longitudinal smooth muscle, with the exception of the mouth, the pharynx, the upper esophagus, and the external anal sphincter. Those are all skeletal muscle because you have control. So basically, like, you can control your mouth because you choose to open it, you use it to speak, breathe, right, other things besides just eat. The pharynx and the upper esophagus, because this is going to be because of you swallowing. When you swallow, you choose to, right? It's a conscious decision to choose to swallow, like your food. Once it gets past a certain point, it becomes a reflex, but the first bit, that first action to start that process of swallowing is going to be voluntary. And then the external anal sphincter, this is also voluntary, right? So think about it. You may have the urge to use the bathroom, but you don't immediately just poop yourself, right? You can hold it until you get to an appropriate bathroom, right? So you can get to a bathroom where you can eliminate that in a socially acceptable way, right? Otherwise, if you use smooth muscle and it was involuntary, you would literally just poop yourself. With the muscularis externa, we have the two layers. With one, we have an exception, a couple exceptions. The stomach, which has a third layer of smooth muscle. It's oblique, so it's going to go at an angle. And then the large intestine has these three bands of longitudinous smooth muscle called the teniae coli, or teniae coli. And then the very outermost layer is the serosa. So this is what we're talking about if we're looking at the inside of the abdominal cavity, so looking at the stomach and the intestines. Sometimes this is called the visceral peritoneum. This is continuous with the mesentery that kind of suspends and holds everything in place. If we are outside of the abdominal cavity, the mouth, the pharynx, and the esophagus, the serosa has a new name. It's called the adventitia. Now we do have a pretty intense nerve supply Our nervous system in this case is the enteric nervous system, and we have two plexuses, the submucosal, which is a plexus, also known as the plexus of Meissner, and the myenteric plexus, also known as the plexus of Auerbach. The extrinsic innervation, right? So the intrinsic, right? This is like deep. The extrinsic innervation is the autonomic nervous system, and that's going to help communicate with the enteric. And this is where we get into sympathetic versus parasympathetic. So fight or flight, and rest and digest. So in fight or flight, right, with the sympathetic nervous system, it's going to restrict the neural activity of the enteric nervous system, so less digestion, which if you think about it makes sense, right? In fight or flight, right, we're talking emergent situation. We need to either run away, we need to fight, or maybe we freeze up, but we still feel those same effects. And at that moment, our body is prepping for immediate survival. At that moment, digestion is not that important, right? Because it doesn't matter if you digested your sandwich if you have to run away right now to save yourself. With parasympathetic, the rest and digest, this will activate that neural activity because everything's calm, there is no emergency, we can put our focus on a slower, necessary process like digestion. In terms of the blood supply, we are going to see a lot of blood vessels branch off of the aortic arch and the thoracic aorta when we look at everything above the diaphragm. And then as we go down below, we get down towards the abdominal aorta, we're going to use the celiac trunk for the stomach, liver, and duodenum. The superior and inferior mesenteric arteries is going to be for the rest of the GI tract, so most of the small intestine and all of the large intestine. The veins that are carrying blood away from the GI tract are going to be super rich in terms of nutrients, and because we're coming from like the small intestine and all that, we're going to go straight to the liver through the hepatic portal vein. This page should look, or this slide should look a little familiar, or at least it shouldn't sound too new, because this is joining, this kind of marrying the cardiovascular system. So we've already talked about the celiac trunk, we've talked about the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries already, as well as the hepatic portal vein. If you don't remember those, I would go back to the cardiovascular system looking at the blood vessels. So let's talk about the peritoneum. This is going to be this serous membrane that is basically there to hold everything in place, so that everything's not just sitting at the bottom of your abdominal cavity. We have two sides to the peritoneum. We have the parietal and the visceral. Hopefully by now you've made the connection that parietal is going to be like the more superficial of the membrane, and visceral is the deeper one. So parietal is going to be lining the inside of the abdominal cavity, but visceral is going to actually like hug the abdominal organs, right? It's like right up against it. So the visceral peritoneum is just another name for the serosa. This also becomes the mesenteries and the folds that we see there, but that's something to keep in mind. Parietal versus visceral. Parietal, we saw this with the pericardium, with the pleura, right? All of these different membranes, these membranous sacs that we've seen have the same kind of setup of parietal versus visceral with the same general breakdown. So let's look at the 5 major peritoneal folds. We have the greater omentum. This is also like kind of like an apron basically. It's going to be just over the small intestines and the transverse colon. This is also where we tend to gather some fats, right? Anyone who is maybe, gaining a little weight or a little bit overweight and will have some fat deposited there, myself included. But it's like an apron, right? Literally, we'll look at some pictures where it quite literally looks like a little apron draped over the belly. We have the falciform ligament. This is going to anchor the liver down. The lesser omentum, this is going to help suspend the stomach and the back side of the liver. So the lesser omentum is superior to the greater omentum, just to kind of make that. So don't think lesser greater means location, it just means like the size basically. The lesser omentum is superior, but it's going to be smaller. We then have the mesentery proper, which are going to be bands of tissue, basically just in front of the lumbar vertebrae, and it's going to anchor the small intestines except for the duodenum. And then the mesocolon, this is going to attach the portions of the large intestine to the posterior abdominal wall, so to the back abdominal wall. So all these are basically working together to hold all of these organs in their place so that they're not shifting around in the body. If you could look at some old-timey descriptions, they did kind of think for a little bit that some of your organs could just move around in there on free form. So not quite doing that. We have anchoring systems in place. So here's our mid-sagittal view. We've cut it in kind of in half here so we can see what it would look like. And so we have them all color-coded. I'm going to focus on the right over here. So we're going to start with the parietal peritoneum in green. See how that's going closest to like the belly? Like it does go a bit deep too, but it generally is on the kind of further away from the organs. We then have the visceral peritoneum, which is in blue. We see that that's all over, right up, hugging against all those organs. We have the lesser omentum, which is here in yellow. See, it's small, right, in comparison. Versus the greater omentum, which is this big piece here hanging down. Again, it's like an apron. We have the mesentery proper, which again is holding all those intestines so that as they're winding their way around, they are not like slipping or falling over each other. And we already mentioned the parietal peritoneum again, but we see it, it really goes all the way around. So, oh, and then the mesocolon, right here, which is holding that transverse colon. So here's the greater omentum. See how it literally is like an apron, just whoop, draped right over the front there. Versus the lesser omentum back here, which is much smaller, right? Much, much smaller. If we look at the mesocolon, I know it looks kind of messy, but we see that it's kind of going all over, but we see it's like following along the ascending, right? Holding up the transverse, and then falling down alongside the descending and the sigmoid.